Mariam Kauser, and I'm going to keep this fairly brief. Welcome so much for coming to the Gendered Politics production. Today, first off, we have Negin Dahya. Negin is a doctor at the University of Washington in the US, and we will then have Laura Mora, who will be starting her PhD in Manchester, University of Keele. And after that, we will have Dr. Kirsten Pike from the Northwestern University in Qatar. First up, Negin, would you like to start?
Thank you.
Should I close the door?
Okay, good afternoon, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to try to talk through some of my ideas and thinking related to post-coloniality and power structures embedded in the digital media production process when working with young people. This work was conducted during my dissertation. I just started my first year as an assistant professor at the University of Washington, and I'm thinking really about the stuff towards the end and kind of the next steps. So I would love, at the discussion point, of course, any questions or conversation, but also in particular thinking about, how we really address some of these issues, in following sort of stages. So I'll just briefly talk a little bit about sort of post-colonialism and the way that I'm using, the term post-colonialism, just so we're all sort of on the same page. Anya Lumba talks about post-colonialism as a way of describing an ongoing state of inequity based in historically situated power relations that are related to the politics of racial and cultural difference. So I want to really be thinking specifically about that as I go through the examples from the study and consider sort of what it means to think about power relations related to racial and cultural difference in this context. I'm also looking specifically at post-colonial feminist theory, so in particular decentering gender as the focus of women's study, considering the intersections of class, race, gender, patriarchy, and other factors relating to the ongoing oppression of women, and then also exploring issues of representation, homogenization, and voice with regard to women of color, and in particular with regard to women of color in the West. So thinking specifically about othering and notions of sort of outsiderness in relation to these particular community members. So this work, as I mentioned, was based on my dissertation, and there is one article published on one aspect of the work, which I'll sort of highlight here, and then I'll kind of let you know where that portion ends, just in case you're interested in reading more about that, and then I'm going to talk through some other aspects of the work from the dissertation as well. So one of the big questions that I've sort of been focused on is related to who really has the power in the process of creating digital media. So who has the power in the digital and visual world of media, both from the standpoint of making that media and then from the standpoint of who's viewing that media and how it's being viewed and how it's being consumed. So I conducted this study as an intervention. It was a 3-year ethnography with a feminist focus. So a sort of feminist ethnography allowed me to ensure that the voices of the girls who were involved remained at the center of the study. It also implicated me in the research process and also maintained a kind of focus on silence and omission. So I made sure to really be attentive to and think about some of the absences throughout the research process and weight those as part of the sort of data that was collected. Just very briefly in terms of what I actually gathered. So I conducted interviews with 14 of the students who were girls, primarily Muslim girls, though some not, because it was an ethnography in the school environment. I actually opened the study up to any girls, and there was, by design of that particular demographic makeup in the school, a large majority of Muslim students anyways. But I didn't make it exclusively for Muslim students, nor did I ever ask or require that Islam be a focus of conversation. So the idea was to give them an opportunity to speak about the things that they wanted to speak about their interests and experiences, whatever those may have been. I video recorded a lot of the working sessions when they were producing their media. I used the actual media that they produced as part of the data, so I coded all of this work, as well as collecting field notes. and then I coded everything and looked, drawing on Sarah Pink's Doing Visual Ethnography, looked across all of these different data that were collected, and sort of compared and contrasted some of the findings. And that's what I'm going to try to present to you here. Some of the more interesting and salient sort of examples about what was collected and what came out of this work. So this is an example that I just want to use to, I think, really highlight some of the things that come up. Hopefully it'll work. I didn't actually check if the sound was working. But I want to sort of emphasize the way that the content of the digital media productions that were made by participants were influenced by both sort of tangible and intangible social, cultural and technological sort of factors that were a part of that media production environment. So I'm going to start by showing you this. This was a video, and sorry, I should just say that the actual programming was sort of threefold. So there was a girls' media production club, which was focused on creating digital video that was meant to be for blogs, and this was based in part through what they wanted to do and what they showed an interest in, although we had a lot of sort of barriers to actually getting that going in the way that we wanted. There was also an after-school video production club that was focused on news broadcasting, which was something that we had done before in previous years of the study, and that was a boys and girls mixed club. And then we had a final field trip at our university where we did a full day of media production at the end of the year. So this is from the news media broadcast, the news media club, where they were working after school. And this, okay, it's not going to play. That's okay. It's really short. It's a minute. I can just sort of retell to you exactly what they talk about. There's three girls. This one we refer to as Nadia, another child, Salima, and then Anara, who's video recording. The two girls on camera are both Muslim. Sometimes they wear hijab to school, sometimes they do not. All three are black. And in this video, they talk about a narrative. So Nadia interviews Salima, Anara is filming, and they retell a narrative of racial discrimination. So basically, they talk about Nadia asks Salima if she's ever experienced any bullying, and Salima says yes. At the water fountain, a white girl pushed me and told me that the fountain, that I couldn't use it because I was black, essentially. So this seemed quite stark. So I asked them afterwards if this happened, especially given there's very few white students in the school. And they said no, it was a story that they had heard. It was a story that they had encountered and that they knew about. Now, in this shot, which I'm going to assume is also not going to work, I think, by the way, I copied over the files. In this shot was of the interview that I also conducted with them. So I conducted interviews with all of the students, and in this interview, these girls talked to me about religious discrimination, lived experiences of religious discrimination that they actually encountered in the school and in the community. So Nadia talks about kids on the playground making fun of her for wearing hijab, and Salima talks about walking down the street and then harassing her and her sister, saying that they should get that shit off their head and that they're in Canada. And then she expresses at the end that what the guy meant, these are her words, she says, what he meant was get that ugly, ugly headscarf off your head. So this was a very powerful kind of moment. They're retelling these stories, and yet the work that they produce in their media production club after much media literacy, media education, it wasn't just like, here's a camera, go. There was a whole long process of talking about different topics that might be of interest, about how you want to use that kind of space and so forth. This was not something that they chose to talk about, in that environment. So part of the conversation for me is thinking about, how we start to conceptualize youth-made media, particularly in these kinds of difficult contexts where there are these sort of social justice conversations and conversations about oppression. How do we think about those as representative of students' lives if we're not actually aware of and really thinking about the context in which those media are being made and all of the factors that are related to how that media is being produced? So throughout the year, none of the students talked about the religious or gender discrimination that they discussed in their interviews. So many of the girls also talked about gender discrimination, though they didn't talk about that in their films on camera. But none of them also created any videos that were celebrating things that they enjoyed about the school and the community, including for many Islam, which they would talk to me about, at least, you know, on the day-to-day in our encounters throughout the school, in which I was able to document fairly well in field notes. So this also, you know, led to some different questions for me in terms of what was really coming out of all of this work. And there is a much more in-depth discussion of that video, as well as that example, as well as another example related to the ways in which certain narratives were privileged over others in this study, and that this sort of common discourse around racial segregation, which is talked about in the school, was something that seemed to be allowed and seemed to be allowable for them to talk about in these videos, compared to their religious discrimination or religious celebration, none of which was really a part of the dialogue that was happening in the school environment. So I want to just take a few minutes to talk about some other sort of outcomes from this study in terms of this digital media production process. So in addition to the sort of discrepancies between you know, what they were talking about in terms of their own experiences and what they were presenting in this example on camera, a lot of work didn't get made because these girls were very hesitant to actually be on camera and to complete that work. So this shot was from, this is actually a screenshot from an interview, not a production that they created, but two other girls who didn't want to be on camera. Now, while Salima, who we saw in the previous sort of clip, talked about herself as not just ugly in reference to that incident of harassment, but in other instances throughout the year, she would talk about herself on camera as ugly. And this is not surprising for girls who are kids and teens to be self-conscious and dealing with body image issues and all of that. But certainly there's another layer that's involved here when facing something like wearing hijab and being harassed about that, and then this becoming an additional layer in that process. And in particular where as digital media producers in these youth environments, you are the producer and you are the subject of the film, which is not really typical in a professional filmmaking environment where those who are behind the camera are not also in front of the camera. So there's an interesting sort of relationship here that is different from professional filmmaking. In this case, these girls talked about how they actually didn't want to engage in popular culture. So they were actually displaying resistance to the mainstream kind of popular culture and popular media, particularly with regard to an obsession with sort of body and beauty image, as well as fashion and clothing and all of those kinds of things. And yet this also would never become sort of a voice and part of the conversation in the media that is made that would have been shown in school or to their peers, because they actually refused to participate. Though that form of resistance would only really be shared in this kind of a space due to the sort of research confidentiality issues that of course come with documenting this kind of a conversation in an interview. I also just briefly want to sort of think about and talk about the audiences involved, and that will come to the last sort of point here, which is in the Girls Media Production Club, we're very little, only one actual film was produced in the end, lots of unfinished clips and recordings, but only one film, which was meant to be for blogs that were online. In the After School News Network, there were 3 films that were produced, all of which were about bullying, and that was meant to, those videos were to be screened just in the school community, so you know at the end of the year in an assembly. What we also conducted though was this field trip at the end of the year, so a full day field trip at York University, and in the technology enhanced learning building, the little extra support from staff and researchers. Some of the technology was a little bit different. Just to make things quick, we skipped the sort of video recording and file transferring, which we also found to be quite a barrier to the process, and just had them record directly onto laptops. This is very limiting in terms of the creative, form and the shots and framing and things that you can complete. But they all created videos on this day, and they all talked about, different things related to role models and interest in technology. They talked about Black mentors primarily, though they didn't talk about any. One of the girls talked about her mother as a role model. Everyone else talked about Michelle Obama, Martin Luther King. They talked about us, about the researchers and the teachers who were involved as people that they were interested to sort of be like. And they talked about technology and video games and all things that they were interested in. Now, I don't say that to suggest that this space is actually a sort of better or more authentic or more representative space for this kind of production, but rather to sort of draw attention to the ways in which this environment framed a particular kind of outcome, so that the discourse that they presented to us in this space was very much related to the context and the environment that we had actually created for them. And potentially, and something that I definitely want to be looking more into, the nuances of the different kinds of equipment in use may also have a fairly strong impact on what they were able to do and interested to do. So the questions that I want to, so I'll just say this bit and then we'll get to the final questions. So the idea being that the lens we take, the way we look at and present information about the outcome of these students' work matters immensely in the context of framing and reframing narratives of non-dominant communities. The intersectional issues related to race and religion are sort of evident in the types of things that they were talking about, but so is the absence of Islam. So through the field notes and through the things that they talked about throughout the year, and by nature of their sort of embodied existence, it was very evident that there were things here to be discussed, and yet they were not things that ever seemed to make it into these particular media forms. So for me, this really points to a need for more close, in-depth interrogation of context, tools, and the environments related to the media production process for young people, in particular as all of these really impact the outcome of the work that is produced. And this kind of draws a little bit on actor network theory, if any of you are familiar with that, and thinking about kind of networks of associations that actually include the tools and the material kind of artifacts involved as enacting on the process, so that whatever we do and however we engage is in part, in relationship to these complex networks. The questions that I have at the end here are related to the relationship the students have with news media that informs what they chose to talk about in their productions. So thinking about the larger scope of news media, and this is yesterday when I Googled Muslim Girls CBC, which is our main broadcaster in Canada. You get these kind of really sort of concerning and negative kind of connotations around the conversation of being a Muslim girl in the public domain. This is something I would like to really interrogate further and think about to what extent this impacts what these students felt they could or should talk about in that news media form. For those who are blogging, how do the narratives of fear and risk in online media and the internet impact students' ability to have a voice in these spaces, even when the tools and the training are available to them. This one I think we have a fair amount more information about, because there's so much research going on in terms of young people and security online, and there's a lot of evidence suggesting that a lot of the narratives are fear-based and coming from parents and educators are very restrictive, rather than creating sort of skills that allow people to participate online in safe ways. And then finally, what is the role of the camera or the camera compared to a computer or other tool to mediate, influence, or inform the storytelling process? So really thinking in much more detail about the tools that are involved, and in what way our relationship with those tools and with different tools shape and form and elicit particular kinds of narratives from the communities that we're working with. And so those are my big questions at the end of my presentation, and that's it. I think you probably need this USB space. Is that?
Laura will be starting her PhD in the University of Keele very soon about the Islamification of fashion, I suppose.
opportunity to learn a lot today. It's my first time to be in London and my first time to touch upon the topic of female or gendered media production. What I'm going to do is present part of my PhD proposal. So I haven't actually done research in this topic yet, but I hope to present some of my questions and that you will be generous with your advice and tips. I'm going to read from my phone, by the way. Okay, so in hijab fashion, or as it's called as well, modest fashion or Islamic fashion, young Muslim women combine Western clothing in stylish ways while trying to abide by Islamic principles, uncovering their sexual beauty or sexual attractiveness. So within just a few years, hijab fashion grew massively. You can see on the screen some examples of the images that are being produced online. I remember back in 2011 when I conducted my bachelor research that no one really heard of hijab fashion or Islamic fashion, and it was only for the early adopters. And now in 2015, it has become mainstream, and so many women take inspiration from the images that are posted online. And I find it such a fascinating subculture for a number of reasons, but most importantly because it involves the production of images by and for girls, women, young women. So much has been written about the representation of Muslim women in mainstream media. And the website of the International Museum of Muslim Women says, quote, "The media has become fixated with the way Muslim women look and what they are wearing or not wearing instead of who they are and what they're doing. Muslim women are portrayed in the mass media as voiceless, submissive, passive, and oppressed victims instead of powerful and creative." And on top of that, some Islamist groups create a certain ideology of how Muslim women are supposed to dress properly, judging or shaming women who dress otherwise, claiming that it's not Islamic or modest enough. So in this context of mainstream media reducing Muslim women to a certain stereotype, and the so-called Islamist patriarchy reducing women's sartorial choice, I would like to quote Susan Faludi, who said, "Feminism asks that women be free to define themselves instead of having their identity defined for them." So in this digital age, Muslim women are turning the tables. Recent trends show that young urban Muslim women counter stereotypes actively by making use of social media. Women can now produce and spread images of themselves in their best outfits and let their voice be heard worldwide using Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, blogs. And there are even movements such as the Mipsters or modest street fashion. So here's what I want to analyze. So that's, for example, the style pages, the inspirational pages on Facebook, Instagram, hijab tutorials in which women explain how to wear a hijab and how to wear it in a certain style. Style magazines and blogs and some movements. So in my PhD study, I shall argue that analyzing Muslim women's cultural interventions initiated by and for women is essential in order to grasp the significance of social media for women's agency. And by agency, I mean the agency to challenge gender norms or Islamist gender norms on how to dress and to explore female Muslim identity in a different way and create social transformations in communities around the world. So my current impression is that hijab fashion radiates the desire to celebrate women's experience of culture, creativity, identity, religion, and beauty. And some of the hijab fashion platforms focus on displaying new headscarf styles, so that's mainly focused on beauty and appearance, while others are actually self-defined communities with creative, activist, and emancipatory ambitions, such as the Mipsters. So what hijab fashion means to some women can be read in an example given by Nushmiya Khan, who's a video journalist. So while too many selfies and too many hours watching YouTube tutorials can't be good for anyone, I've had too many women tell me that hijab is so much easier to wear now that there are so many more creative and comfortable ways to wear it. We don't need to look unkempt to be considered practicing Muslim women. I actually found that many converts were so much more comfortable wearing hijab because Muslim fashionistas had offered them more presentable ways to wear it. And this is exactly what Dina Tokyo, or her real name Dina Turkia, aspires. She's a well-known British fashion designer and blogger, and as I call it, a hijab celebrity. So that means that she has a lot of media exposure and she tries to inspire other girls. The Guardian voted her as the third most influential person on social media under 30. She said by working in the fashion industry, she counters stereotypes and she helps herself and other women to wear the hijab in times that she finds it difficult to wear it. In this sense, women seem to benefit a lot from hijab fashion. These hijab celebrities and style pages on Facebook and Instagram have thousands of followers and photos get thousands of likes. So here we see Dina Tokyo from the UK, Dalal Adouk from Kuwait, and Bess Mackay also from the UK. And one of the remarkable things is the major role of self-representation, manifested in selfies and tutorials, for example. Given the fact that social media plays such a big role in hijab fashion, I believe it's crucial to analyze this subculture in the context of cultural studies. And some of the questions that come to mind are how are these women portraying themselves instead of being portrayed by mainstream media? What are the limits and possibilities of self-representation in terms of introducing new identities? And how do these images relate to power? There are some scholars who've written extensively on this topic already, such as Raina Lewis, Annelies Moors, and Emma Tarlow. And they are a great inspiration to me because they wrote about questions such as how can fashion and religion go hand in hand, and what are the aesthetic and economic implications of the hijab industry, and how are connections being made by women of different faith backgrounds who all dress modestly yet stylish. Whereas this existing literature is mainly written from an anthropological point of view, I approach the topic from a cultural studies perspective. Oh yeah, and some of them are written from fashion studies as well. But I think it's important to critically question the meanings of media representations and the framework in which they are produced. This means that I will focus more on feminism-related concerns such as emancipation, agency, power relations, and intersectionality. So with my research, I intend to fill in an important gap by asking, is hijab fashion emancipatory or does it reproduce sexism, racism, classism, and consumerism? And do women use hijab platforms to challenge these inequalities? So my study is motivated by this main question: how do Muslim women change the discourse on modesty and hipness? How do they use self-representation on social media to create new feminine identities? And how can agency be rethought in the context of hijab fashion? And I believe I should answer this question through three methods of analysis. So that would be media analysis, interviews, and a philosophical element. In the media analysis, I intend to examine the complex relationship between representing the self and conforming to a culture's visual codes. So by applying Stuart Hall, his theory on decoding, I shall perform a media analysis to see how images relate to dominant ideologies. What do these images look like and why? And where is women's own agency located in displaying selfies? Also, I plan to perform a critical discourse analysis on the online debates on modesty and hipness, and asking who defines the boundaries of hipness in the context of modesty and religion. About the interviews, I want to interviews to analyze the way in which these women experience hijab fashion as beneficial or enriching their lives. And second, to analyze the internalization and negotiation of dominant ideologies that resonate in hijab fashion, and to see to which extent they're aware of certain dominant ideologies reproduced in their media. So my inspiration to do this comes from reading Bell Hooks' literature on raising awareness of Black youth to develop critical thinking towards the mainstream representation of Blackness. her idea of agency and critical thinking is taking responsibility in engaging with images and teaching youth to do that. So the philosophical part of my research is about emancipation or agency in a non-liberal context. So that's in a context in which women don't resist norms, such as religious norms, but they willingly submit to religious norms in order to create a pious self. So I think this is the outcome of this study will be important for the academic reflection on the concept of agency as well. And I will use I will use Saba Mahmoud's concepts to do that. So one could say that women globally are winning a lot of ground to dress accordingly to their own interpretations with the help of social media. According to Esma Bardas, women's initiatives are often one of the most powerful internal impulses for social critique and change in Muslim communities. And this is most evident when they use internet to bypass traditional gatekeepers that claim to speak in the name of Islam. But one could also question to which extent hijab fashion is emancipatory or constructive or sustainable. Because often you see images of fair-skinned girls wearing things that hint at a higher class sort of taste in a glamorous or urban environment, posing according to certain maybe even slightly sexist beauty standards. So according to Milestone and Meyer, gender norms continue to be reinforced throughout popular culture, leading to constructing women as inferior, reducing them to their physical appearance. So given this reproduction of gender norms and other norms, what are the limits to the online creation of new feminine identities? I think it's important to find out, since this affects the emancipatory potential of hijab fashion. If young women don't critically reflect on systems of inequality, they could maintain forms of oppression and disadvantage themselves and each other without even knowing that there is so much at stake. If media production is not actively used to challenge inequality, can it truly be emancipatory? So representation and consuming images apparently make a big part, make up a big part of my research. But today, I strengthen my will to also question the production part of hijab images. And because I'm new, I'm not sure how to do this. So my learning questions for today are therefore: how can I include the production element in my research? Can user-generated content be seen as producing media, or is it merely subjected to the dominant structures of Facebook, Instagram, etc.? And what are the newest online research methods by which I could analyze how the production of hijab fashion images is conditioned? And I already took some inspiration for the answer to these questions from the other speakers. So thank you very much for allowing me to share my initial thoughts with you. And I very much hope that you enjoyed it, and I'm also confident that your feedback will be fruitful to me. So if you have tips, or if you want to add me on Facebook, then you can take my email address. Thank you.
Thank you very much, that was amazing. So we're kind of doing well for time, and last but not least we have Dr. Kirsten Pike from the Northwestern University in Qatar. Sure.
So upon moving to Qatar 3 years ago to teach media studies at Northwestern, I was intrigued to discover how popular princess-themed media narratives were amongst my female students, almost all of whom grew up in the region. So conversations I was having in the classroom inspired me to want to learn more. I wondered, which characters and gendered themes do Arab girls value? Which do they reject, and why? And how have Arab girls' encounters with both Western and non-Western princess media shaped their cultural experiences and gendered identities? So to explore these questions, I conducted IRB-approved interviews with 14 Arab female students at NUQ about their engagements with princess media culture. While the interviews covered a range of topics, my presentation today focuses on the ways that Arab girls have used Disney princess media as a source of inspiration for working through problems and also as a springboard for crafting new stories more attuned to their gendered interests and identities. Ultimately, my analysis supports research by scholars such as Mary Celeste Kearney on the progressive potential of girl-made media to destabilize dominant race and gender ideologies while also reaffirming girls' agency within the landscape of youth media production. So just a short note about demographics, and I'm happy to answer more questions later. Although the girls in the study trace their roots to a variety of places in the Middle East, including Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and Saudi Arabia, all but one grew up in Qatar. All reported that religion was a moderate or major part of their lives, and all but one identified as Muslim. The girls described their socioeconomic background as either middle or upper middle class, and all were unmarried, fluent in Arabic and English, and ranged in age from 18 to 24 years old when I conducted the interviews. So perhaps it'll come as no surprise that girls in the study, who were born during Disney's animation renaissance in the 1990s, avidly consumed Disney princess movies during their youth. Most reported having watched Disney princess films between 25 and 50 times each, while 4 said they had watched certain favorite films such as Beauty and the Beast more than 100 times. A participant named Muna offered the highest viewing estimate of her favorite film when she guessed she'd seen Beauty and the Beast like 1,000 times. as she explained, quote, "I've seen it so many times I can actually speak with them, the characters, while they're speaking. Like I know what they're going to say before they say it," end quote. The girls also reported regularly watching the Disney Channel during their youth, loving especially the Aladdin and Little Mermaid spin-off television series. And when I asked which princess products they collected, if any, all gave examples of Disney media merchandise, bless you, with many indicating that they own complete collections of Disney's animated fare in both English and in Arabic. And this is a photo that one of my students gave me of her collection of some videos that she had. And you can see in the Arabic versions that there's some shading on the characters to cover her body and make it more modest looking on the Little Mermaid. Okay. So as these details suggest, the Disney brand is extremely popular in the Middle East. It's not unusual, for instance, to see Arab children sporting Disney clothes and accessories, with girls showing a particular fondness for Disney princess items, which are sold in numerous retail outlets around Doha. So I just have a few images. These were all taken by my students just around town. This was in a media and book shop promoting Little Mermaid stuff. These were taken at Toys R Us in Doha. And one of my students put together a kind of collage of different Cinderella products that she had found around Doha, including one ad for what looks to be a high-end shoe with Cinderella sort of promoting it. Yes, and here's also an advertisement promoting back-to-school stuff featuring Little Mermaid. Okay, so recent animated films, including Brave and Frozen, enjoyed successful runs in local movie theaters, and since the debut of Disney on Ice in the Middle East in 2013, there have already been 3 Disney Ice shows in Doha. Thus, young people in Qatar have certainly contributed to the success of the Disney Princess brand, which now exceeds $3 billion in retail sales globally. So what appeals to Arab girls about Disney princesses? Some girls explain their fondness for a particular princess by making connections between the heroine's virtues and values advocated in their Arab upbringing. Muna, for instance, connected her passion for Belle with childhood lessons she'd learned from her mother, including the importance of getting an education and choosing a romantic partner based on the quality of one's character. Although many girls identified with culturally valued feminine traits such as beauty and kindness, characteristics coded as masculine appealed to some girls precisely because they fell outside the realm of normative traits traditionally promoted to girls in Qatar. Hasna, for instance, appreciated Mulan's strength and independence, as well as the freedom embodied by Kiara, the youthful lion princess in The Lion King 2, Simba's pride. As she explained of her connection to the latter, quote, "I've always felt like independent, and I wanted to do things like I wasn't allowed to do that weren't expected of a girl. Like, to me, Kiara, going wherever she wasn't allowed to go, is like basically representing travel. Because like, boys can go wherever they want, but like in our culture, girls can't travel alone, like it's not allowed. So like, I've always wanted to travel and just like be more independent around the world," end quote. In a similar vein, Merida, who eschews the cultivation of beauty and romance in favor of outdoor adventures, resonated strongly with Nora. As she explained of Merida's story, quote, "I felt like I could relate to that a lot because she's portrayed more as a tomboy, and I've had like very similar fights with my mom about a lot of the same things. What I loved about that story was that she was able to establish a connection with her mother, and in the end, she kind of does get what she wants, which is a little bit more of her freedom to express herself," end quote. So Nora's account of Brave's gendered appeal, including more independent heroine and a more compassionate rendering of a mother-daughter relationship, aligns with popular commentary that sees Brave as a refreshing shift in the Disney princess canon. Yet what's particularly compelling about Hasna's and Nora's insights is that they remind us that there are productive aspects to girls' interactions with Disney princess culture. With the ever-expanding body of popular and academic criticism that tends to see princess culture generally and Disney princess media specifically as an insidious cultural force, from Peggy Orenstein's and Jennifer Hartstein's warnings about princess culture's potentially deleterious effects on girls, to the myriad scholarly studies that find Disney princess media perpetuating harmful stereotypes, it's crucial to consider how girls actually use this media to work through real-life problems, to contemplate traditional and alternative pathways, and ultimately to navigate their own futures. So this is not to suggest that scholars and critics shouldn't critique princess media's problematic commercial and cultural ideologies, of which of course there are many. Rather, what Arab Girl's viewpoint suggests is that princess media narratives are best understood when the pleasures and possibilities they offer to girls are considered alongside criticisms of their textual limitations. So how have Arab Girl's interactions with princess media shaped their cultural activities and gendered identities? I think I meant to put that up so we could look at all of them. Notably, more than half of the girls, 57%, reported that their childhood experiences with princess media led them to engage in new forms of princess-themed cultural production, a finding that counters popular discourses that frame girls as passive recipients of hegemonic media messages. Raina, for instance, wrote and illustrated princess stories and comics in her childhood free time, and she also composed, directed, and acted in princess-inspired videos and plays with her sisters. Likewise, Muna devised a new princess narrative for Disney's Belle as part of a 4th grade school project. In her fairy tale, she constructed Belle as a beast instead of a human, a move that not only made her a stronger and more suitable match for her love interest, the beast, but also challenged traditional ideas about how a princess should look and act. When the two characters eventually fell in love, they both became human. Although Muna's story adheres in some ways to romantic conventions, it also deconstructs Belle's customary beauty and femininity by reimagining the heroine in the realm of the abject. This, combined with the story's foreshadowing of the princess as beast premise of the hit movie Shrek, which came out after Muna wrote her story, testifies to the narrative's captivating nature. Some participants detailed more recent princess-themed creations. Ariana, for example, demonstrated how she uses Photoshop to construct whimsical princess-themed visual media collages for family and friends. And Mariam offered a fascinating account of the princess-themed theatrical play that she wrote, produced, and starred in at her high school when she was 17 years old. The production featured approximately 25 female actors and 4 public performances, and it countered traditional gendered outcomes in that the heroine, despite being sought after by the prince, refused to become a princess in the end. The reason, Mariam explained, was that she liked being herself. She liked being normal. Just as many feminist critics heralded Brave's merit for finally giving us a princess, so too does Mariam's play, a point made even more persuasively perhaps by the fact that all roles, including the prince, were performed by girls. Ultimately, by choosing to have our heroine forego marriage to lead a more independent life, Mariam's play boldly altered the traditional happily ever after ending of princess tales, and did so significantly ahead of Disney's Brave. So interestingly, 64% of the participants reported that their childhood experiences with princess media had shaped their personal and/or professional goals, including for several of the girls their decision to pursue media studies at NUQ. Sabrina, for instance, said watching Disney princess movies had made her want to write more stories about girls to counter representations of passive females that she had encountered in Disney princess films. In a similar vein, Layla related how her contradictory encounters with commercial media generally, and Aladdin specifically, had inspired her own filmmaking ambitions, including creating more authentic representations of Arabs. As she explained, when I was younger watching Aladdin, I never perceived it as Arab. It never dawned on me because Jasmine, Aladdin, their features, I would say their dress, their palaces, their architecture, looked more Indian, so I didn't relate to it at all. And it inspired me like now in my films to always be like very hyper aware when I'm representing an Arab character, because now I feel like it's my responsibility to like make people aware that there's a difference. Indian culture, even religion, language, dress, it's all completely different than Arab. And perhaps to a Western audience that might not have ever traveled or been exposed to this side of the world, they might not understand the difference. But to me it's kind of offensive, so now I want to change it, end quote. Although not all the participants engaged in creating their own princess media narratives, 86% indicated that it would be beneficial or highly beneficial for girls to create their own princess media narratives, such as stories, poems, videos, plays, and/or games when they're growing up. More freedom for girls to tell their own stories and more diversity in the kinds of stories they might tell were themes that emerged in many responses. So despite the recent spate of popular discourses rebuking princess culture's numerous ideological problems and pitfalls then, my project highlights how Arab girls are indeed consuming, yet also countering dominant narratives with creative stories of their own. And this is a photo of one of our students, not a student that was in my study, but one that agreed to have her image posted on our website. She's making a film. This discovery brings to mind Naomi Wolf's recent recommendation that Disney princesses be read more productively by critics and parents. Citing the strength and capabilities of Mulan, Belle, and Mia, she coolly advises, quote, "Don't worry if your 5-year-old girl insists on a pink frilly princess dress. It doesn't mean that she wants to subside into froth. It just means, sensibly enough for her, that she wants to take over the world," end quote. Like other girls around the world, Arab female youth are imbricated in an ever-growing web of commercial princess narratives, most of which circulate contradictory ideas about what it means to be a girl. Yet in raising their voices through cultural criticism and powerfully recasting gendered norms in their own creative works, girls in Qatar demonstrate that they are active agents in the growing global march toward improving girls' media and, by extension, the cultural experiences of Arab female youth in the Middle East and beyond. Thanks very much.
So I'd just like to invite all our panellists back up here and we can engage in discussion. So that was really interesting, really enlightening. That's amazing. So I'd just like to start off the discussion a little bit. What I'm hearing from a lot of your presentations was technology plays a crucial amount of importance in how they kind of create their own identities, but also how much do you think it's formed by this kind of issue of access, particularly with you, Negin, your students were willing to go off camera and say what they wanted to, but when the issue was about creating something and having it be projected out there, do you think that the question is they need role models to encourage them to do that, or should there be more workshops such as yourselves that encourage them that it's okay to be out there and be vocal and take over the world as a princess would?
That is a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, certainly, I think in terms of the piece about the role of technology as well, kind of in that question. You know, we could see by the end with the field trip that they had learned the skills. I mean, they did learn throughout all of the starts and stops and incomplete productions and not wanting to edit and, you know, this and that. They did learn to edit. All of those final films that were done in one day had titles and credits, and they had, you know, they got all of the skills. So that's a success, though. You know, the question of content and representation and then also empowerment is sort of a complicated one, because where does the empowerment happen? Does it need to go out into the world in order for that to become something where these young people have acquired a kind of agency? And if they have learned skills to produce video, then they potentially have more opportunities to do what they want or not want with it. You know, so what would make them go out and do more? I don't really know, but I'm also not sure that that's the question that we need to answer. So it's a good question, but I just don't know that it's one that has a clear.
Does anybody else have any questions? We've got a number of questions. Adrian?
Yeah, what I was going to ask or sort of comment on, one of the things that I saw as a connection there was sort of the public and private kind of dimension, which I think would be really interesting and perhaps contradictory in, you know, given the cultural background of these young women and girls, and sort of how, and I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on how you saw that kind of playing into it. Is this also part of the public-private, you know, kind of their own negotiation of what is publicness and what is privateness? I don't know.
Is that for everybody?
Yeah, sure. I mean, whoever wants to take it.
Well, maybe if somebody else has some thoughts on that, and I could also add something later.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, actually. This came up when I was actually conducting my interviews and doing the research itself, where in terms of public and private, I wanted to see examples of what the girls were creating when they were remembering things from their childhood. A lot of it was too old, but also in terms of photographs, some girls don't want those things to be shared. So it came up with just devising like what kinds of methods you can use. The one example that I got to see was just a girl that was willing to share with me some collages she had made on her phone, which was kind of cool. But more broadly speaking, this also comes up in some of the student films that are created. A lot of the girls at NUQ don't want to be on camera. It's shifting and it's a preference. I mean, some do, but there are fewer that do than those who don't. Those are just some thoughts off the top of my head, but I think it's a good question worth thinking about.
Yeah, I'm gonna think about it some more.
No, it's totally fine.
Yeah, because there's a component in my research on, most of the pictures, most of the selfies, you could say that they're in a kind of private environment, but they're made for public exposure. So I'm not sure yet how to answer that now. So, but thank you very much, because I really want to take it.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I think it would be process. Cool.
And I also think it definitely played in terms of you know, where there was a comfort level in terms of the exposure of the internet and the audience, whether that is a real or a perceived audience or an imagined audience that they thought would be viewing. I think certainly impacted, and that hesitation came through in some of the behind the scenes sort of discussion about, you know, and the obsession with filming the perfect, you know, looking perfect on camera and filming you know, so some of these things I think, you know, relate there, but also maybe more directly my relationship as the embedded researcher and my self-identification throughout my time as someone who had grown up in a Muslim home and who understood some of these sort of, you know, community celebrations and practices, and there was definitely a kind of alliance there where now they could talk to me about this kind of stuff. Whereas at least again in the spaces that I was able to observe, it did not appear to be a common conversation, and so that too I think, you know, this private public in a different kind of way. And maybe that also ties back to your first question in terms of what kind of environment do we need to have in order for people to feel more comfortable in doing these things. So.
Jen?
Yeah, I really enjoyed the panel. I thought it was really interesting and fascinating, different perspectives. But I was curious about, the kinds of images that came up in these young women's minds. Like you mentioned, Michelle Obama is coming up and what have you, and the princesses and what have you. And I was curious about women who are girls like Malala, who are in the news, and I'm wondering if they ever come up in conversations in any of the work you've done as either in a negative example, like the Western media has appropriated this woman, or as a positive example.
Yeah, I'm trying to think back to my interviews. I can't recall off the top of my head if anyone talked about Malala. Mine was more about princess themes, but I did ask a bunch of questions about real life princesses that I hope to analyze in a future study. I had several mention Michelle Obama, a couple mentioned Princess Diana, and most of them all touched on Sheikh Moza, who is now the mother of the current emir. She was like the first lady when I conducted the interviews, but they really see her as an inspiration. And I guess she is sort of like a queen figure, but they also think of her more as a first lady. So her daughters are sometimes thought of as princesses from the Western world, but in Qatar, it's not quite the same meaning. They're more like first daughters or something. So some of them actually weren't quite sure how to respond because they didn't think automatically of their leaders in the royal family as princesses, but I got them to talk a little bit, about that. So.
I think something that is also related to sort of your interests is that for the students that I worked with, a lot of them didn't have much at-home internet access and freedom to actually go and encounter, for example, the many images of different sort of women online and women in different places and women in hijab and women who are, I can't remember exactly what year Malala was shot, but was it that long ago? Okay, so that definitely would have been.
But then she won the Nobel Prize after that.
Right.
So what year? As a Nobel Prize winner, maybe she would have been brought up, particularly in the Muslim
last year.
School.
So this was 2012. So that might have. So that might not have come back, and they would have been very young when she was first shot. So that might have been missed as a specific example. But I mean, so I think that's also that question of the relationship with the mass media and the popular kind of culture, in that what they have access to because of the restrictions on going on the internet and the restrictions both from parents and the school in terms of what they're allowed and not allowed to do, but then also the access issues of being an under-resourced sort of school community. A lot of them didn't have internet at home.
Hi, I see that you have been studying, fashion, hijab as a way of fashion. I was wondering if you have considered this as a means of oppression for women and it in relation to political Islam. And Laura, you said that about hijab as a fashion matter since 2011. I lived most of my life in Iran, and I've experienced the Islamic revolution, Islamic regime after the revolution 1979. And it's been a sort of a protest rather than a fashion thing, changing, the way you wear hijab and the scarf and everything. And I was wondering if you have looked at that thing, like hijab under Islamic regimes in Islamic countries, but right.
I think that will be part of my introductory chapter, because there are many reasons or aspects to wearing hijab, of course, and the context plays a big part in that. But I'm going to interview specifically British young Muslim women in Manchester and Birmingham. So I'm wondering how they, what hijab means for them, of course, and maybe some of them will come from Iran or from other countries where it was a political sign or maybe a sign of oppression even. So I'm really curious about their story specifically. But one tendency of hijab fashion is that is this Muslim prideness or Muslim pride to show that you're Muslim, and on the other hand is a question of beauty as well. So I think I can't go too deep into the political situations around the world in hijab, but I think it's definitely something that I need to explain and in my introduction chapter and to ask the participants about it. Yeah, so thank you very much for the suggestion.
First, final question.
I have two questions.
Two questions?
For Mariam.
Negin.
Negin. You mentioned that there was an absence of reference to Islam, like in this. I wanted to ask you why is that from your perspective? The other question is for Laura. I was reading, I'm doing a study about women online also, and I was wondering, is this phenomenon kind of self-objectification that they are being their like celebrities and how they look to others, especially using the selfie and Instagram, especially Muslim ones. So, what do you think about it?
Well, it's a very big question, and it's the question that I have in the back of my mind as well, of course. That's maybe even the reason for doing this research. But I promised myself not to answer it until after 3 years of research. Because I don't wanna get into, I don't wanna start this research with with a stubborn head or something. I want to be open and to see the positive sides, the negative sides, and to speak with women and how they experience it. Yeah, of course. And I even have my own thoughts and experiences as well, of course. So the question I ask myself often is, would I do that? Would I be a hijab celebrity? Yes or no? And why? And with regards to objectification, yeah.
So just to pause there, I've just sent somebody to ask them to tell the man to stop.
It'll be done before they get to it. That's fine. Yes, so
We just have to be clean.
yeah, that's all right. It's a difficult question because the question is actually asking me to, identify cause to something that is absent, right? So that is something that I'm not sure that I can, with any certainty, sort of say this is why or this is why not. Though what I sort of theorize in the paper that's in Diaspora, Indigenous, and Minority Education is really related to the larger sort of discursive frameworks that are available to young people within the boundaries of school. So what is talked, and that comes from, the ways in which there were moments of conversation with me and an absence of observation of similar conversations with other people. But that is all I can really comment on because I didn't follow them in every classroom and in every conversation, but in my observance of them with other people and in the classrooms that I did see, Islam was never discussed in the school. It was not in announcements when there was something to celebrate, despite the huge community. When it was Eid, it was never an announcement about Eid, right? Oh, let's all congratulate and celebrate and all of these things, even though about half the population in the school is all Muslim, right? So these things didn't happen, even though the kids would come in and, maybe say something to me, oh, we had this great party on the weekend and, did all of these things. That's sort of the theoretical standpoint that I'm sort of thinking about right now, that it's related to what has been allowable. And bullying, on the other hand, which they talk about a lot, is constantly discussed in school, assemblies, posters. So perhaps the answer to the question is more, what I can say more is that what they do talk about are the things that seem to already be talked about in the school.
That was my question. So it seemed like in everyone's talk, Islam is this implicit force, but it's not like because I'm Muslim I'm doing this, or Islam says this, so I do that, which is, it just strikes me so opposite to the narrative that we hear about Islam.
I think in my discourse analysis, it will come to the front that especially the opposers of hijab fashion, they derive their arguments from Islamic sources or Islamic speeches. That it's not appropriate, or it's not modest, or it's not even modest in the sense of spending money on some material things. So I'm curious if the women themselves are justifying their choices from Islam. I know that Islam makes up a big part of their identity. That's why they began this subculture of hijab fashion. That's why they want to wear hijab and to show they're Muslim. So.
Well, I suspect that'll depend a lot on how you ask the question to them, right?
Yeah, I really have to think about that.
Because you could quickly prime them to talk about Islam. I mean, if you ask them the question in a particular way, it's a difficult thing.
Can you give an example?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you say, well, what about your Muslim identity makes you want to wear the hijab, as opposed to just asking them why do you wear the hijab?
Yeah.
In sort of my experience in asking those kinds of questions, when you ask why do you do that, and someone hasn't really thought about it before, the interviewer comes in with some suggestion, like, do you wear it because of a cultural reason or because of...
Yeah, in 2011 I asked them why, and the number one reason they said because it's obliged by the religion, and then they mentioned other reasons as well, so it's interesting.
Did they come to that answer quickly? Like, when you asked them the question, did they immediately get that answer?
Yeah.
Or did you have to prompt them?
Because they were actually all from my network in that time, which was Islamic organizations and I say mosques and women's groups, and so these are all women that want to be active in the religion or somehow. But now I expect a more diverse group of women, so maybe also more diverse answers.
Yeah. I would suspect too that, again, context is really important as well. So if you go to Malaysia and ask that question, or you ask it in Birmingham, you'll have very different answers.
Yeah.
One final question by Ken?
Yeah, just to piggyback off the last comment that you made, Laura, I was wondering what the Muslim women that you plan to speak to, where will they be from? Because I think my opinion is a lot of the dialogue around Muslim women is that we seem to treat them as a kind of homogenous group. And the point that was raised about the hijab in Iran, that is the hijab as a political tool in Iran would be different to somewhere, like at the moment actually it's happening, I'm not sure if you'll follow, but that My Style Fear Freedom, the online campaign, and it's basically driven by a young Iranian woman, Iranian American woman, I think, and it's basically, she's encouraged all these people to take the hijab off and take a photo of their hair. And so there's this kind of, obviously the geography and the political system around that shapes the relationship with the hijab. So I wonder if you will be thinking about that and how you locate then the subjects, because the example you gave of Instagram, the bloggers, fashion bloggers and whatnot, I follow a few of them, and it seems to me, I only follow a few of them, but the ones like, they're mostly based in like Dubai or the UAE, where there's this kind of culture of consumerism and excess or whatnot, so yeah.
Yeah, in a context in which the hijab is quite normal, whereas in a Western context it's sort of active choice. Or
yeah, well in UAE, like I've just spent some time there, it seems to be glamorized and like, you know, beauty is kind of consumerism thing.
Yeah, I lived in
Very
Kuwait. I saw it as well. Yeah, but what I find interesting about this kind of movement or the new generation that follows hijab fashion is that ethnically they're so diverse, and it almost seems as if it doesn't matter anymore where you're from, except that the Turkish girls have a really particular style of wearing it, whereas the others they copy each other's styles, and it doesn't really matter. There's not so much ethnic symbolicism or something in the hijab, in this kind of fashion. Maybe Kuwait will wear a certain style, or Turkish will wear a certain style, but I'm interested in race, the aspect of race as well in my research, and not only because it seems to sort of blend or doesn't matter anymore. Really, for example, a Pakistani girl wouldn't necessarily wear a Pakistani hijab anymore because the new generation just buys it at H&M or something. But on the other hand, I think race is so interesting when it comes to the representation. So what I see is that it's most of the time it's fair-skinned girls. And for example, Basma K, she's a bit darker, but then the lighting is so that she looks fair. So I was wondering if the white beauty standards all around the world are being reproduced again. The light Malaysian girls, the light Kuwaiti girls, so yeah, thank you. I will definitely consider the political context and ethical background. Thank you.
I think we're going to be going on to lunch very soon, so thank you very much, and thank you.